The sea off Korsfjord was a sheet of liquid steel, pewter grey under a thin, shifting canvas of cloud. It was May 1941, and the northern Atlantic felt less like an ocean and more like an indifferent, cold and eternal void waiting to be filled with fire and grief. Aboard the Kriegsmarine battleship Bismarck, a world-ender of unprecedented design, Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann stood on the bridge, the smell of salt and freshly oiled mechanisms sharp in his nostrils. The air was tense, but not with fear. It hummed with anticipation, like a colossal spring being wound tight. The ship beneath his feet was a masterpiece of Teutonic engineering, 834 feet long, displacing over 50,000 tons fully loaded and bristling with 8 15-inch guns housed in 4 colossal turrets named Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora. She was not merely a ship, she was a floating fortress built to sever the transatlantic arteries of the British Empire, a physical manifestation of Hitler's ambition to choke the island nation into submission. Operation Reinübung had begun. Alongside the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, the Bismarck had slipped past Norwegian fjords, and the watchful eyes of neutral Sweden, now pushing north to pierce the gap between Iceland and Greenland. Their mission, unleash hell upon the Allied convoy routes. Lindemann, a traditional and cautious naval officer, had deep respect for his foe, the British Royal Navy. He knew the pride and fury that the British attached to their sea power. He also knew that the moment the Bismarck was definitively identified, the entire might of the home fleet would be launched against her. He was entering a cage fight, where the cage was the entire North Atlantic. "The weather is holding, Captain," reported the first officer, Fregattenkapitän Hans Oehls. "Visibility fair, sea state 2, perfect hunting conditions." Lindemann nodded, his gaze fixed on the churning water ahead. "And perfect stalking conditions, Hans. The British know we are out. Their reconnaissance aircraft will be crawling over the pack ice like flies on carrion." He was right. On the morning of May 23rd, the Bismarck and Prince Eugen, masked by snow squalls and fog, were navigating the dense ice fields of the Denmark Strait. They were ghosts in the Arctic twilight, but even ghosts cast a shadow. In the chilly gloom of the strait, the cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk were conducting a tedious, freezing patrol. Their crews were on edge, the radar screen spitting back constant, frustrating static, the white noise of the Arctic. Suddenly, aboard the Suffolk, the radar operator gasped. A contact, massive and moving fast, had materialized far beyond their visual range. "New contact, Captain," the voice cracked with disbelief. "Bearing 285, range 60,000 yards. She's huge, sir. Too fast for a convoy, too big for a cruiser." Captain Robert Ellis of the Suffolk felt a jolt of ice-cold dread and exhilaration. "It's her! She's through! Signal the Admiralty immediately. Enemy battle group, 1 battleship, 1 heavy cruiser, proceeding southwest in the Denmark Strait." The chase was on. For the next 8 hours, the lightly armed British cruisers played a dangerous game of hide-and-seek, clinging to the edge of the radar horizon. Every time Bismarck tried a zigzag maneuver or slipped into a snow squall, the patient British spotters held their breath, waiting for the massive shadow to reappear on the screen. The electronic pulse of their radar, amplified and distorted by the cold air, was the thread connecting the hunter and the hunted. Aboard the Bismarck, Lindemann was furious. He knew he was being tracked. The faint, rhythmic ping of the British radar was an irritating mosquito he could not swat. The cat-and-mouse game had eliminated any hope of surprise. The Royal Navy knew where they were and where they were going. 400 miles to the southeast, the response to the Suffolk signal was swift and decisive. Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, put the vast, complex machine of the Royal Navy into motion. But the closest strike force, tasked with intercepting the Germans before they could break out into the open Atlantic, was Force H, the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The Hood was less a ship and more a legend, the pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship in the world for 2 decades, and a symbol of British naval dominance. But she was an aging legend. Commissioned in 1920, she had weak deck armor, a vulnerability tragically exposed by modern plunging shell fire. Aboard the Hood, Vice Admiral Lancelin Holland was a man under immense pressure. He knew the weaknesses of his flagship, but he trusted her mythos and the firepower of her 8 15-inch guns. He was accompanied by the Prince of Wales, a state-of-the-art battleship still undergoing post-commissioning trials, carrying civilian factory technicians alongside her battle-hardened crew. Her guns were temperamental, her crew green. As they steamed northwest through the night of May 23rd, the sea was rough, throwing spray high over the Hood's foredeck. Holland's plan was simple: close the range quickly, before the Bismarck could utilize the lethal precision of her 15-inch guns at long range, and engage in the close-quarters melee for which the Hood was designed. At 5:37 on May 24th, through the lifting fog and low clouds, the lookouts on the Hood spotted the German fleet, 2 dark, lethal silhouettes against the grey, icy horizon. "Enemy sighted! Bearing 020! Holland ordered his ships to close in, sacrificing the full potential of the Prince of Wales' rear guns in the rush to bring the Hood's forward batteries to bear. It was a calculated risk born of necessity. Aboard the Bismarck, Lindemann received the report with grim stoicism. "Contact, Captain. 2 heavy units, bearing 180. Lindemann scanned the horizon through his binoculars. The leading ship, massive, instantly recognizable, the 4 imposing forward turrets, the legendary profile. "The Hood," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. The behemoth of the British fleet had arrived, and the new one, the Prince of Wales. The German command, under Admiral Günther Lutyens, had been debating whether to engage. Lutyens, keen to avoid battle and achieve the breakout, initially sought to break contact, but the distance was too short, the British too determined. "They are engaging, Admiral," reported Uels. Lutyens made the final, fateful decision. "We must defend ourselves. Fire when ready." The first shells of the Battle of the Denmark Strait screamed through the sky at 05:52. It was the British who opened the engagement. Aboard the Hood, the forward 15-inch guns, the heaviest naval artillery in the world, fired with a deafening, chest-compressing roar. The concussion rocked the great ship, and the shells, traveling at incredible velocity, plunged towards the German formation. The Bismarck responded almost immediately. The first salvo from turrets Anton and Bruno was short, splashing harmlessly in the freezing water, but the second was devastatingly close, straddling the Hood. On the Hood's bridge, Admiral Holland watched, his face a mask of determination, willing his flagship to close the distance. Then disaster struck. The third salvo from the Bismarck was a masterpiece of lethal gunnery. One shell slammed into the Hood's superstructure, igniting cordite cases near the catapults and sending a pillar of orange flame momentarily into the air. This was damage, but not fatal. The very next salvo was the executioner's stroke. A 15-inch shell from the Bismarck's turret Bruno, fired from over 9 miles away, hit the Hood just aft of the mainmast, in the weakly protected area near the aft magazine. It wasn't the projectile itself that caused the catastrophe, but the chain reaction it initiated. Deep inside the bowels of the Hood, the unimaginable happened. The shell, having penetrated the light deck armor, detonated in or immediately adjacent to the 4-inch or the primary 15-inch rear magazines. A monstrous, incandescent explosion tore the great battlecruiser apart. A blinding flash, a fireball of such colossal power it seemed to suck the color out of the grey morning, erupted through the midsection of the ship. The noise was not a boom or a crack, but a sustained, horrific, grinding roar that muffled all other sounds. Aboard the Bismarck, the Germans watched in stunned silence. The bow and stern of the Hood separated in an instant, rising into the air like two broken arms, pleading with a merciless sky. The ship, that had been the pride of the fleet, the symbol of an empire, vanished beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. Smoke, black and oily, mixed with the steam and the burning orange of the explosion, creating a terrifying, swirling column that rose thousands of feet into the air. The sea around the sinking site, the surface of the Atlantic itself, was momentarily ablaze with the flash and the wreckage. Lindemann, momentarily speechless, finally broke the silence. The Hood. She is gone. Admiral Lutyens, seeing the destruction of the legendary ship, felt a moment of terrible triumph and chilling foreboding. He ordered the ship to hold fire on the sinking wreck, showing a flash of grim professional respect. The destruction of the Hood was almost total. Of the 418 men aboard, only 3 survived. Aboard the trailing Prince of Wales, the sailors watched the apocalyptic scene unfold just yards ahead. The massive fireball, the sudden disappearance of the legendary ship, it was a psychological blow, as devastating as the physical one. The Prince of Wales was now alone, facing 2 perfectly ranged German warships. She fought on, however, turning sharply to avoid the wreckage and the oil slick of her lost consort, her inexperienced crew fighting to control the new ship's unreliable 14-inch guns. The Bismarck shifted her focus, and within minutes, 5 heavy shells found the Prince of Wales. She took hits on her bridge, her compass platform, and suffered damage to her internal machinery, crippling her speed. Her foremast was twisted, and her bridge suffered casualties. Captain John Leach realized the fight was untenable. He needed to survive to keep the Bismarck within range for the rest of the home fleet. At 06:13, the Prince of Wales turned away, retreating behind a thick smoke screen. The engagement was over. Aboard the Bismarck, there was a sense of wild, intoxicating victory. They had sunk the greatest battlecruiser in the world with a single salvo. Lindemann, however, was sober. "Report damage," he commanded. It was not long before the grim news arrived. During the frantic exchange with the Prince of Wales, the Bismarck had taken 3 hits herself. 1 shell had passed through the forward bow, smashing internal compartments and rupturing fuel tanks on the port side. The ship was taking on thousands of tons of water, reducing her speed and flooding the No. 2 boiler room. Crucially, the forward oil tanks were contaminated with salt water, rendering over 1,000 tons of fuel unusable and creating a visible oil slick that trailed the ship like a black thread. "Admiral," Lindemann addressed Lutyens, the victory already tasting like ash. "We are down 2 knots and we are leaking fuel. The oil slick is visible. Our path to the open Atlantic and rendezvous with the convoy lanes is compromised. We must turn." The decision was made. Operation Rheinübung, the grand commerce raid, was abandoned. The Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was the prize. Lutyens made the fateful call. The Prinz Eugen would separate and continue the original mission, while the damaged Bismarck would make a desperate 1,800-mile dash for the port of Brest in occupied France for repairs. As the ships parted, the German fleet's great victory evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a wounded giant now limping across the ocean, leaving an easily detectable trail of fuel. The North Atlantic was waking up. The news of the Hood's annihilation had electrified the Royal Navy, transforming the hunt from a military operation into a national vendetta. Every available ship, submarine and aircraft, stretching from Scapa Flow to Gibraltar, was now focused on one name: Bismarck. The great game had begun, a vast, deadly chase across the expanse of the ocean. Captain Leach, aboard the retreating Prince of Wales, knew the loss of the Hood was a catastrophic blow to British morale. But his task now was simple and absolute. Do not lose contact. Despite his ship's damage and the intermittent failures of her armament, Leach pressed his ship forward, relying on the radar of the battered Suffolk and Norfolk to keep the German battleship in sight. For the next day, the pursuit continued under the cover of intermittent squalls and fog. The British ships were shadows, doggedly clinging to the fringes of the German radar. On the afternoon of May 24th, Lutyens made a brilliant tactical move. During a sharp turn, the Bismarck briefly engaged the pursuing British ships, forcing them to take evasive action, then slipped away undetected under the cover of a vast, rain-laden cloud front. When the British ships emerged from the squall, the Bismarck was gone. The radar screen on the Suffolk was suddenly, chillingly blank. The oil slick had dissolved in the tempestuous waves. "She's vanished, sir," the radar operator reported, his voice hollow with disbelief. "We've lost her." The news sent a shockwave through the Admiralty in London. The most dangerous ship in the world, having just destroyed the symbol of British naval power, was now loose in the vastness of the Atlantic. Admiral Tovey, aboard his flagship HMS King George V, ordered the entire fleet to change course. He knew Lutyens would be heading for the relative safety of Brest. The search area was immense, over 40,000 square miles of treacherous ocean. Hours turned into agonizing, terrifying silence. Every moment the Bismarck remained free. She was a threat to the convoys, sustaining Britain's fight against the German U-boats. Then shortly after 10:30 on the morning of May 26th, 2 days after the sinking of the Hood, the Royal Navy received a message that changed everything. A young flight officer aboard a Catalina flying boat, a lumbering, long-range patrol aircraft, had spotted a disturbance far below the clouds, a faint smudge of black oil. Following the slick, he broke through the cloud base. And there she was, alone, listing slightly but moving fast. The colossal grey shape of the Bismarck was once again steaming toward the French coast. The message crackled over the airwaves. Bismarck sighted, position 4933 north, 2147 west. The ghost was found. The final act was about to begin. The entire Royal Navy, fueled by grief and rage over the loss of the Hood, turned to descend on the wounded beast. The sea would soon run black with oil and red with vengeance. The hunt was truly on. The day the ocean burned was drawing near. The Catalina's signal ripped through the airwaves, a thunderclap of relief and fury. Admiral Sir John Tovey, aboard his flagship HMS King George V, immediately computed the German ship's position and course. The Bismarck was still heading for Brest, only 690 nautical miles away, putting her dangerously close to the range of German air cover. Time was running out. Tovey, his face etched with 2 days of sleepless worry and the fresh wound of the Hood's loss, drove his ships relentlessly eastward. But the true, immediate striking power lay with Force H, commanded by Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, centered on the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Aboard the Ark Royal, the deck was a hive of frantic activity. The venerable fairy Swordfish biplanes, nicknamed string bags for their wire and fabric construction, were preparing for launch. These planes were anachronisms, slow, ungainly, and obsolete. Yet they carried the Royal Navy's most lethal anti-ship weapon, the torpedo. The weather that afternoon of May 26th was savage. A gale had sprung up, driving mountainous waves across the Atlantic. The Ark Royal pitched violently, making the deck a chaotic death trap for the air crews attempting to load the torpedoes. Visibility dropped to near zero in the driving rain. At 19:10, 15 Swordfish, loaded with 1,600 pounds of explosive death, fought their way into the howling sky. Their mission was simple: cripple the giant before the battleships arrived for the kill. Aboard the Bismarck, Captain Lindemann knew the clock was ticking. The damage taken in the Denmark Strait had been temporarily contained, but the list remained, and the vital fuel loss was a constant damning reminder of their vulnerability. "We are in the window, Captain," reported Admiral Lutyens, his voice sounding brittle with stress. "If we can maintain this speed for another 12 hours, we will be under U-boat and Luftwaffe protection." Just then, a lookout screamed, "Aircraft! Bearing 270, low, approaching fast." Lindemann rushed to the bridge wing. Through the squalls, he saw them, the unmistakable, almost comical silhouettes of the fabric biplanes. "General quarters! Open fire! All guns bear!" The great fortress erupted in a furious, useless storm of flak. The 10.5 cm and 3.7 cm anti-aircraft guns spat a barrage of shells into the turbulent sky. But the Swordfish, weaving and bobbing through the clouds and the massive shells, were undeterred. They were flying so low, skimming the wave crests, that many of the Bismarck's gunners could not depress their weapons far enough to hit them. One by one, the Swordfish plunged into their attack runs. The first wave of torpedoes plunged into the churning water, leaving white trails. They were aimed for the thick belt armor, where they would likely detonate harmlessly. The Bismarck executed violent turns, her engineering crew pushing her hard, dodging the incoming fish. The first hits were near misses, spraying water high over the deck, but achieving nothing. Then came the second, more determined wave. A pilot named Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat plunged his plane toward the starboard side. His target was the stern, the vulnerable Achilles heel of any warship, where the propeller shafts and rudders lay. At 20:47, Moffat released his payload. The torpedo dropped, hit the water cleanly, and ran straight. On the Bismarck, men held their breath as the torpedo closed the distance. Lindemann watched helplessly, the ship's momentum too great to evade the attack in time. The explosion was not magnificent, not the cataclysm that destroyed the Hood. It was a sickening, muffled shock, felt deep in the spine of the giant ship. "We are hit! Aft starboard quarter!" Lindemann waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, expecting reports of flooding. What came next was far, far worse. "Captain, damage report. We have severe shock damage to the rudder assembly. Both rudders are jammed." "Jammed? At what angle?" "Jammed hard over to port, sir. 10 degrees." Lindemann stared at the compass repeater, a creeping horror seizing him. His 50,000-ton fortress, the technological marvel of the Third Reich, was suddenly and utterly paralyzed. She was locked onto a wide, sweeping course, a course that inexorably turned her away from the safety of Brest and back toward the vast, approaching enemy fleet. The Bismarck had lost the ability to choose her destiny. Panic, a slow, insidious poison, began to creep through the lower decks. Engineers immediately descended into the cramped, oil-fouled stern compartments. They found the scene of absolute chaos. The explosion had crumpled steel plates and twisted the massive rudder shafts. The blast had occurred directly on the rudder posts, jamming the electro-hydraulic steering gears solid. For the next 10 desperate hours, the crew fought the impossible. They tried everything, using the massive propeller thrusts to compensate for the rudder and steer the ship, counter-flooding forward compartments to change the trim, and even attempting to use explosive charges to blast the jammed rudders free. The engineers descended into the flooded, oil-slicked compartments beneath the waterline, working with acetylene torches and sledgehammers in conditions that defied endurance. The sea was an enraged beast, pitching the stern violently. Every man knew the truth. If they failed, the ship was doomed. They failed. The rudders were locked, a 10-degree immutable command forcing the warship into a massive, slow, fatal arc. Lindemann and Lutyens spent the night in a shared nightmare on the bridge. The proud, indomitable battleship was now a wallowing, predictable target, drifting helplessly into the path of vengeance. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, having located the crippled giant, sent in the smallest, fastest hounds to worry the wounded prey. Commander Vian's flotilla of 5 destroyers, HMS Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Piorun, closed in. All through the black, stormy night of May 26th, the destroyers conducted relentless torpedo and gun attacks. They were too small for the Bismarck to effectively target, darting in and out of the colossal waves and darkness, their wakes barely visible. The Polish captain of the Piorun radioed his famous, defiant message. "I am a Pole. I have the honor to command Piorun. 3 cheers for Poland," before charging the battleship. Though none of the torpedoes found their mark, the harassment was a strategic masterstroke. It denied the Germans rest, prevented any further repair attempts, and illuminated the Bismarck's position with star shells and flares, ensuring she could not vanish a second time. On the Bismarck's bridge, the roar of the massive guns firing in the dark, the constant frustrating near misses on the swift destroyers, and the incessant rolling motion reduced the crew to exhausted, sleepless wraiths. Lutyens, realizing their fate was sealed, sent his final message to the German Naval High Command. "Ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell." The morning of Tuesday, May 27, 1941, dawned grey and cold, but the sea had calmed from the gale of the previous night. The skies were clearer. It was perfect weather for a gunnery duel. At 08:43, the first heavy shapes emerged from the gloom on the horizon, the unmistakable towering silhouettes of the British battleships HMS Rodney and HMS King George V. The Rodney, an old but powerful warhorse armed with 9 16-inch guns, the heaviest guns in the home fleet, had been ordered to close to short range to ensure her shells struck the Bismarck's vulnerable vertical armor belt. The King George V, Tovey's flagship, would provide covering fire. Aboard the Bismarck, Lindemann gave the command for the final, desperate battle. "All turrets target Rodney, range 20,000 meters. Open fire!" The Bismarck responded to the threat one last time, unleashing the synchronized, house-shaking roar of her 15-inch guns. The first salvo was slightly long, but the subsequent fire was precise. The Rodney responded with a terrifying, coordinated wall of fire. The shells from the 16-inch guns, looking like flying telephone poles, plunged towards the German giant. The battle that followed was not a duel of maneuver or tactics. It was an execution by overwhelming force. The Bismarck, slow and sailing in an agonizing circle due to her jammed rudder, was a fixed target. At 08:47, a 16-inch shell from the Rodney slammed into the Bismarck's turret Anton, smashing the rangefinder and killing the majority of the command personnel on the forward bridge. Within minutes, another massive shell struck the forward fire control center, completely blinding the ship. Lindemann, realizing the main gunnery had been disabled, ordered his men to continue firing under local control. The crew, despite the relentless, punishing barrage, fought on with grim fatalism, but the blows came too fast, too hard. 09:02, turret Bruno, the turret that had fired the Hood's fatal shot, was struck and silenced forever. 09:13, turret Dora was hit and disabled. 09:21, turret Caesar was finally silenced. In less than 40 minutes, the Bismarck, the most powerful battleship in the world, had been reduced to a floating wreck. Her massive 15-inch guns, her teeth, were gone. The bridge was a smouldering ruin. The main masts and funnels were shredded metal, and enormous fires raged below deck. Admiral Tovey ordered the battleships to continue firing at point-blank range, pouring heavy shells into the wreck to ensure the destruction of her vitals and prevent her sinking into German hands. The Bismarck's secondary armament continued to spit defiance, but the British battleships pounded her mercilessly. The Germans, trapped in a burning metal coffin, suffered unimaginable casualties. Lindemann, after giving his final, desperate orders, was last seen standing at his post on the ruined bridge, accepting his fate. At 10:15, after nearly an hour of relentless close-range shelling, Tovey realized the Bismarck was no longer a threat. She was a ruin, a carcass, burning from stem to stern. Tovey ordered the battleships to cease fire and conserve their precious ammunition. The final blow would be left to the cruisers. Cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Norfolk closed in, ready to administer the final necessary death blow with torpedoes. Aboard the Bismarck, the survivors, choked by smoke and wounded, prepared to abandon ship. The order to scuttle, to open the seacocks and detonate internal charges to ensure the ship's destruction, was given. The Germans would not let their legend be captured. At 10:36, the Dorsetshire fired 2 torpedoes into the starboard side of the listing hulk. The ship began to roll violently. The Norfolk fired a final, decisive torpedo into the port side. Slowly, almost majestically, the great battleship began to capsize. The forward momentum was spent, and she rolled onto her port side, the massive red-painted bottom of her hull rising high above the waterline. For a few agonizing minutes, she hung there, a final monumental monument to war and engineering. Then, at 10:40 a.m. on May 27, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Third Reich, slipped beneath the waves of the Atlantic, 300 nautical miles west of Brest. The ocean did not merely close over her, it devoured her. The spot where she sank was instantly covered in a vast black slick of oil and debris, the last terrible proof of the battle that had transpired. Of the 2,200 men aboard the Bismarck, only 114 were rescued. The hunt was over. The British cruisers pulled survivors from the icy water, the 2 navies, moments before locked in a fight to the death, now united in the grim business of rescue. The massive, crippling threat to the Atlantic lifeline was gone. The sea had burned with cordite and oil for 3 days, swallowing a legend in the process, but the long, terrifying nightmare of the pursuit was finally at an end.